The Vanguard, one of humanity's last powerful warships, shook violently as plasma blasts slammed into its hull. The red lights flashed across the corridors, alarms howled like a dying beast, and the walls groaned as if they were about to tear. Apart, enemy ships from the Keller Dominion, a brutal alien empire feared across the galaxy, were attacking without mercy. Side the ship, chaos spread. Soldiers scrambled. Engineers shouted commands and the wounded cried out in pain. Somewhere in the deeper levels of the ship, an alien woman named Celia moved quickly, dodging sparks and ducking beneath pipes that had burst from the heat. She wasn't human. Her skin was ash gray, and her eyes glowed faint blue, but she had once served the Keller before defecting. After seeing what the humans were capable of, how they treated even their enemies with strange kindness, she had chosen to leave her empire and join the humans. Now, though she was unarmed and alone, trying to survive the attack while the ship crumbled around her, thick smoke made it hard to see. The emergency lights flickered. She turned a corner and rushed down a hallway, her boots slapping against the metal floor. A loud explosion rocked the ship, throwing her against a wall. She coughed, pushed herself up, and forced open the nearest door, hoping to find shelter or a working console to contact the bridge. The door slid open with a hiss, and she stepped inside. It closed behind her, sealing tightly with a sharp thud. The room was silent. Dark, except for a single red light glowing softly in the corner. Along the walls were weapons-heavy rifles, railguns, and strange human gear she didn't recognize. A long table stood in the center, covered in flickering maps and data screens. Standing beside it was a man, tall, broad, covered in old combat armor scratched and burned by battles long past. He didn't look surprised to see her. He didn't even flinch. He just stared at the maps, as if studying the fight outside. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep and steady, like stone. He said she wasn't supposed to be there. Celia steadied her breath and answered that she had taken a wrong turn. The man turned toward her slowly, and for the first time, she saw his face under the helmet-hard lines, sharp eyes, and a calm that didn't match the storm outside. Introduced himself as Commander Holt, last surviving officer of the ship's heavy weapons unit. Then, as if it didn't matter, he told her the ship's power core had been hit and life support would fail in 15 minutes. She blinked in shock, surprised by how calm he was in the face of death. She asked why he was just standing there. He turned the screen to show her the battled dozens of red enemy dots surrounding the Vanguard. They were trapped, the humans. Were losing. But Celia stepped forward, her eyes fierce. She asked why he wasn't fighting. He looked at her for a long moment, then replied that he was just one man. What difference could he make? She answered without hesitation. He wasn't. Alone, she had once fought for the Keller. She had trained with their weapons. She knew their ships, their strategies, their weaknesses. And more than anything, she wanted them destroyed. That caught Holt's attention. He studied her again, slower this time, and after a tense pause, handed her a railgun module from the weapons rack. He asked if she could handle it. Her response was sharp and sure. She snapped the module into place like someone who had done it 100 times. She had been trained to kill, after all, just not for this side. Now, things had changed. A small grin touched Holt's face. Grim, but real. Then he nodded once. The quiet understanding between them needed no more words. Together, they would fight back, and so, in a moment, shaped by chance and war. Two enemies stood side by side, an alien woman who had stepped into the wrong room, and a human soldier who had nothing left to lose. But what neither of them knew, yet was that this accidental meeting would not only save a ship, it would light a fire that could turn the tide of a war. Celia followed Holt out of the weapon room and into the chaos of the ship's lower decks. The halls were filled with smoke and sparks, and every few seconds the floor shook as another blast hit the hull. Sirens wailed overhead. The sounds of gunfire and shouting echoed through the corridors. Holt moved fast, his heavy boots striking the metal with purpose. He didn't look back to check if Celia was behind him. He trusted she would follow. She held the railgun tight and kept her eyes sharp. They turned corners, past wounded crew members being dragged to safety, and rushed through flickering doors that barely worked. Down on Deck 7, the battle was fierce. Human soldiers were holding back Keller warriors tall, armored, with glowing red eyes and sharp blade rifles. Celia recognized the creatures instantly. They were scouts fast. Killers meant to move in first and soften defenses. Holt didn't waste time. He charged into the fight, gun raised, and opened fire. His bullets were heavy and loud, each one smashing through Keller armor like it was paper. Celia moved beside him, staying low, firing between targets. Her shots were clean and deadly. She didn't hesitate. Every time one of her former kind dropped, her hands only grew steadier. She was done with guilt. As they fought, 3 human Marines held the hallway ahead, trying to keep a sealed door shut. One of them saw Celia and shouted, accusing Holt of bringing an alien into the fight. The Marine raised his gun toward her, but Holt stepped in front and said she was with him. That was all he said, but that was enough. The Marine lowered his weapon. Together, the 5 of them held the position as Keller pushed harder. The hallway became a war zone of smoke, screams, and glowing blood. Holt ordered one of the Marines to toss a breach charge. When the Keller reached the corner, the blast knocked them back and gave them a few seconds to breathe. Holt then sprinted toward a side panel and activated a lockdown code. Large blast doors slammed down behind the breach, trapping a fresh wave of enemies in the lower bay. For now, one entry point was sealed. Celia caught her breath and wiped blood from her brow. She looked around at the broken lights and scorched walls. This wasn't survival, it was a slow collapse. She turned to Holt and asked, "What now?" Holt glanced at his wristpad. A blinking red signal told him 5 more Keller shuttles had just latched onto the hull. More were coming. They were outnumbered. The ship couldn't take much more. The few defense cannons left weren't enough to stop the enemy's full fleet. He looked at the Marines, and then at Celia, his face unreadable, and said they had only one move left. He would activate the Hellstorm protocol. The Marines froze. One of them said the Hellstorm hadn't been used in years, that it was too unstable, too dangerous. But Holt didn't blink. He said if they didn't act now, no one would live long enough to regret it. The Hellstorm was a massive weapon, buried deep inside the Vanguard's spine. It used a dark energy core band in most human systems for being too unpredictable. Firing it could damage the ship or save it. Celia asked what the weapon did. Holt answered that it was designed to crack capital ships in a single shot. It had never been tested in a real battle. Until now. Celia looked at the map. The enemy fleet was tightening around them, preparing for the final strike. There was no time left. Holt issued the command. The room's lights dimmed, and deep within the ship, the Hellstorm cannon woke from its long sleep. A loud, deep hum began to rise through the walls, vibrating the floor like a distant growl. The ship's AI warned that the core would overload if used for more than one shot, but Holt ignored it. He turned to Celia and simply said, "We shoot once. We make it count." She followed him to the control chamber, where wires sparked and power cells glowed like burning suns. Holt entered codes and adjusted the targeting. Celia watched the screen as a Keller flagship, massive and cruel in design, slowly circled for the kill. Holt locked onto it. The weapon charged. The hum grew louder, and the Hellstorm fired. A single beam of white-blue energy shot out like lightning across space. It hit the Keller carrier in its center. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ship exploded in a burst of fire so bright it turned night into day. Celia covered her eyes. The force of the blast pushed the Vanguard backward. The bridge shook. Sparks flew from every console. But when the light faded, half of the Keller fleet was gone. Destroyed in a single shot, Celia stared at the screen, unable to speak. Holt looked at the results, then turned to her and said, "Now they know we're not dead yet." Around them the ship groaned, but still stood. The Keller caught off. Guard pulled back for a moment. That brief pause gave humanity a chance to fight again. The crew cheered. Celia gripped the railgun tighter. They weren't safe yet, but she knew something had changed. The enemy had come to crush them. Instead, they had awakened something terrible in return. And for the first time, the alien woman realized what it meant to stand with humans. didn't give up. They didn't kneel. Even on the edge of destruction, they still found a way to strike back. The air inside the ship still trembled from the force of the Hellstorm cannon's first shot. The smell of burned metal and charged energy filled the corridors as the glow of the blast slowly faded from the outside view screens. Silence fell for a few seconds as the crew of the Vanguard looked at the battlefield. The enemy flagship was gone, torn apart by the energy beam like it was made of paper. The explosion had taken out not only the massive Keller warship, but several smaller vessels. Nearby, it was a blow the enemy hadn't expected. Across the fleet's remaining lines, Keller ships slowed, unsure whether to continue their attack or retreat. Inside the control chamber, Celia could still feel the energy from the weapon vibrating through the floor. She had seen many weapons in her life, but nothing like this raw, ancient, and terrifying. It wasn't just a gun. It was power that shouldn't exist. She turned to Holt, who stood in front of the control panel, calm but alert, eyes scanning the data as the system fed back warnings of reactor instability. He knew the shot had come at a price. The cannon had taken more power than the ship could safely give. And now the Vanguard's core was starting to break down. Warning lights flashed around them, and the ship's AI repeated in a robotic voice that another shot from the Hellstorm could trigger a full meltdown. The engineers had always said this cannon was a last resort, and now Celia understood why. Holt didn't look worried. He adjusted controls and rerouted backup systems to cool the reactor. His hands moved quickly, but his voice stayed steady. He had seen worse before. She asked him how much time they had before the core failed. He told her honestly maybe an hour if the cooling systems held. Less if the Keller attacked again. But what came next was even worse than another attack. A new signal appeared on the screen, one that chilled Celia to her core. It was a private message, locked in an old Keller frequency. The voice that followed was deep, smooth, and cruel. It belonged to General Cortel, the most feared leader in the Keller Dominion, and Celia's former master. His image appeared. On the cracked hollow screen, a towering figure in black and gold armor, 4 red eyes glowing like fire, speaking with a calm that made the hair on her neck stand up. He looked straight at the camera, as if he knew Celia was watching. Cortel didn't scream or threaten. He spoke like a teacher scolding a student. He told Holt that the humans had surprised him, but their little victory would not last. Die. Said their ship was doomed, their weapon unstable, and their courage foolish. Then, turning his head slightly, he addressed Celia by name. He said she had been a loyal servant once, and that he still believed she could return. He offered her forgiveness, a high place among the Keller again. She abandoned the humans and came back to him. She said nothing, only stared at the screen. Holt's eyes went to her, waiting. Cortel continued, saying the humans would never truly accept her, that she was one of them, not one of Earth. But Celia stepped forward, her voice clear and sharp, and told Cortel that he was wrong. She said she had once believed in the Keller's power and their way of crushing the weak, but now she had seen another way. She said the humans were not weak because they didn't rule through fear. They were strong because they refused to quit, even when everything was burning. Cortel's eyes narrowed. His voice turned cold. He told her she would burn with the rest of them. Then the screen went dark. Celia's hands were shaking, but she didn't show it. Holt nodded once, his face hard. Was leading the fleet, then? The only way to stop the war? Was to kill him. Celia told him it wouldn't be easy. Cortel didn't lead from the rear like most generals. He stayed at the front of battle, surrounded by his elite Garth the Singers. They were fast, quiet, and deadly, trained from birth to protect Cortel. Holt didn't blink. They said, then they would go into the heart of the storm and end it. Themselves. Celia was surprised by how calm he was, even after seeing the monster she once feared most. She asked him if he truly believed 2 people could kill a legend. Holt gave her a small smile, the kind that wasn't for comfort but for war. He told her that humans had always done the impossible. Not because they were stronger or smarter, but because they refused to accept defeat. That was the human way. Desperation wasn't a weakness to them, it was a weapon. Celia nodded, and something in her heart settled. She knew what she had to do. She would face the one who had made her into a weapon. And this time, she would break the chain herself. Holt began making plans. He called for a small strike, team a pilot, and 2 Marines willing to risk everything. The idea was simple but crazy. Sneak onto Cortell's dreadnought in a stolen enemy pod and take him out before the rest of the fleet could recover. 1 shot, 1 chance, and the war might turn. It was madness. But Celia agreed without hesitation. Holt handed her a new railgun, upgraded for close combat. He checked his own armor, loaded his weapons, and looked toward the stars where the enemy ship waited. The time for defense was over. It was time to take the fight to the heart of the enemy and finish what had begun the moment she stepped into the wrong room. The small team moved quickly, wasting no time as they made their way to the hangar. The stolen Keller boarding pod sat on the launch rail, still damaged from the earlier battle but barely flight-ready. Holt and Celia were joined by 2 human Marines, Corbin and Vigand, a pilot named Lynn, a quiet woman with sharp eyes and steady hands. They knew the plan was dangerous. They were going straight into the heart of the enemy fleet, targeting the dreadnought where Cortell waited. It was madness, but it was their only chance. The Vanguard was too damaged to fight much longer, and the Hellstorm could not be fired again without destroying the ship. Holt stood at the front of the pod, checking weapons while Lynn powered up the engines. Celia sat across from him, her face calm but focused. She had trained with the Keller for years, knew their battle tactics, and knew exactly how their dreadnoughts were designed. She told the team where to land, where to move, and what defenses to expect. No one asked why they should trust her. Holt had already made that choice for them. When the launch doors opened, the pod shot out into space, dodging debris and glowing wreckage from the earlier fight. The pilot flew low and fast, weaving through enemy lines. A few Keller ships spotted them and fired, but the pod was small and Lynn's hands were quick. Explosions lit the dark sky around them, but they broke through the fire and slammed hard into the side of the dreadnought. The crash was rough. Sparks flew, the metal groaned, and the door blew open with a blast. Holt went first, rolling out and firing as he moved. Celia followed close behind, already knowing the path. She led them through the narrow service tunnels, avoiding main corridors. Where enemy patrols moved in groups, still it didn't take long before they were spotted. The Singers came without sound, slim, fast killers, with pale armor and curved blades. One dropped from the ceiling and stabbed a Marine through the side. Holt turned and shot the attacker before it could pull the blade free. Corbin was down, bleeding heavily. Celia grabbed his weapon and kept going. She moved like a shadow, fast and deadly, using everything the Keller had once taught her against them. Holt stayed close, taking point when the tunnels opened into wide halls. They reached a central control room and sealed the door. Vega patched up Corbin, while Holt and Celia looked at the map. Cortell was close to levels up, inside the command bridge. The guards would be heavy there. Celia warned that Cortell would expect them now. He was not a coward, would face them himself. They moved quickly through the enemy ship, planting charges to block escape routes and slow down reinforcements. As they climbed the final stairway, the lights flickered, and a deep voice echoed through the halls. It was Cortell, calm and full of contempt. He said Celia was still a fool for turning her back on strength, and that the human beside her would die screaming. Celia didn't answer. She kept her eyes forward and her steps steady. When the doors to the command bridge opened, a wave of heat and light met them. The room was large, with thick black walls and glowing red data pillars. At the center stood Cortell, taller than any human, his armor gold and black, sharp and strong. 4 eyes locked onto them, and 2 Singers stood at his sides, still and silent. The battle began in a flash. Holt opened fire, hitting one guard in the chest. Celia rushed forward and met the other in close combat. The Singer was fast, but Celia was faster. She ducked under a blade and fired her railgun straight into its neck. Sparks and blood filled the air. Now it was just Cortell, stepped forward, pulling a massive energy blade from his back. He looked at Celia with something between anger and sadness. He said she had potential. She said he had chains. Then she attacked. The duel was brutal. Cortel was strong, his strikes heavy and skilled, but Celia knew his style, had trained under it. She moved with purpose, cutting and dodging, wearing him down. Holt supported from the side, firing at weak points in the armor whenever he could. Still, Cortel was a monster. He hit Celia hard, knocking her back, and almost broke through Holt's chestplate with a heavy swing. But Celia didn't fall. She recovered fast, slid beneath the general's guard, and drove a charged blade straight through his chest. Cortel staggered, then dropped to his knees. He looked at her one last time and whispered something in their old language. She didn't respond. She pulled the blade free, and Cortel fell. They had won, but the ship was already failing. Holt moved quickly to the control core and planted the charges. Celia grabbed a data core containing enemy fleet commands, while Vega helped Corbin. Limp through the smoke-filled hallway. Alarms blared as fires broke out along the walls. Holt set the detonator for 5 minutes. Then they ran. The corridors were falling apart, but Lynn had managed to restart the pod's launch engines. The small ship shook as they jumped in, the hatch closing just as the countdown hit 1. As they pulled away from the dreadnought, the explosion ripped through the massive ship. Fire, metal, and light blasted outward, tearing apart Cortel-S. Command center and breaking the heart of the enemy fleet. Inside the pod, the survivors sat in silence, bruised, bloody, but alive. They looked at the burning wreckage in the distance. One ship, one team, had just shattered the enemy's leader. Celia leaned back against the wall, eyes closed, and breathed deeply. She had faced her past, killed. The one who had once owned her life and chosen her side fully. And now, for the first time, she didn't feel like a traitor. She felt free. Holt met her eyes and gave a small nod. No words were needed. I'd done what no one else could. And the war, though not over, had just changed forever. The stolen pod shot through space, rocking as it escaped the blast wave from the enemy dreadnought. The wreckage of Cortel's ship burned behind them, pieces of twisted metal floating through the stars. The explosion had lit the darkness, like a second sun, and for a moment, everything seemed quiet. Inside the small craft, the air was filled with the smell of smoke and blood. The walls were scorched, and sparks danced from broken panels. Corbin lay unconscious, his chest wrapped. In emergency foam, Vega sat beside him, pale and breathing hard. Lynn, the pilot, worked silently at the controls, guiding the pod through what remained of the battlefield. Holt and Celia stood behind her, watching the enemy fleet react in confusion. The Keller ships had paused, their formation broken. Without Cortel's signal, they didn't know what to do. Some began to pull back. Others drifted, unsure if this was a trick. But the humans on the vanguard didn't wait. They saw the dreadnought fall and launched a full counterattack. Even though their weapons were damaged and their engines weak, the crew used everything they had: missiles, railguns, even repaired fighters to press forward. It was a moment of courage, not because they had power, but because they had hope. Celia looked at Holt and saw the fire in his eyes. He wasn't smiling, but something in his face had changed. He had fought many battles before, but this one was different. This was personal. They weren't just surviving now. They were winning. The pod reached the outer edge of the Vanguard's defensive field. Lynn sent a signal, and the hangar bay slowly opened, even though half its doors were damaged. The landing was rough. The pod hit the deck and skidded until it crashed against the wall. Sparks flew, alarms blared, but they were home. Medics rushed in. Corbin was taken away. Vega followed, limping. Lynn collapsed into a chair, finally letting herself breathe. Holt and Celia stepped out last, their armor cracked and covered in dust, but their heads held high. Now the crew gathered around them, eyes wide. Word had already spread. Cortel was dead. The most feared general in the Keller Dominion was Ganand. It had been done by a handful of humans and one alien defector. For a moment, no one spoke. Then someone started to cheer. Others joined in. The sound grew louder until it filled the hangar. People clapped, shouted, and saluted. Not just for survival, but for a real, impossible victory. Celia stood still. unsure what to do with the attention. She had never been cheered by anyone in the Keller army. Respect was earned through fear. But these humans were different. They clapped for courage, for loyalty, for those who stood when they had no reason. 2. Holt turned to her eyes, steady, and gave her a short nod. No words were needed. They had shared battle, fire, and death. That was enough. Later, after the ship was stable and the fires were under control, the leaders met in the main war room. Holt stood at the front. Celia stood beside him, this time invited, not watched. They reported what they saw: how Cortell had been killed, how his dreadnought was destroyed, and how the data core they had stolen held codes for the Keller fleet's current strategy. The human commanders looked through the information. With this, they could strike back. They could find weak points, plan attacks, maybe even force peace through strength. Celia offered more than just the data. She gave insight, knowledge of Keller behavior, the way their ships moved, how their leaders thought. The humans listened closely. Not once did they call her enemy. In the hours that followed, teams used the data to send false signals to Keller ships, confusing them further. Some enemy ships turned on each other. Others fled. For the first time, in many battles, the humans pushed forward instead of falling back. One enemy outpost was taken. Another Keller cruiser was disabled without a shot, tricked into thinking they were surrounded. The tide had shifted. And it all began with a single axe stepping into the heart of darkness to take out its leader. That night, or what passed. For a night in space, Holt sat in the observation deck, staring out into the stars. Celia joined him, her steps soft. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the broken remains of the battle drift like ghosts in the black. Finally, she asked him something that had been on her mind since the fight ended. She wanted to know if, had their roles been reversed, he would have trusted her the same way she had trusted him. Holt didn't look away from the stars. He said he didn't know, maybe not. But when she walked into that room ready to fight, he had seen something real. She had a choice to run or to stand. And she stood. Celia smiled slightly. It wasn't happiness, not yet, but something like it. She told him she had spent most of her life being a weapon. Now, for the first time, she felt like something more. Holt didn't speak right away. Then he told her that humans didn't care where someone came from. They cared what someone chose when it mattered. She had chosen. That was all that counted. As the lights from distant stars blinked across the windows, they sat together, not as human and alien, not as soldier and defector, but as survivors. And in that quiet moment, after fire and death, they found something neither of them had expected. When the war began, respect, trust, and the small beginning of peace, the galaxy was still burning. There were still battles ahead, but something had changed. The war had taken much from them, but it had also given them something powerful in return, a reason to fight, and someone to fight beside. The fires inside the Vanguard had not all been put out, and the scars from the battle still glowed red along its hull. But the crew worked with fresh energy as the ship floated near the edge of the war zone. Though it was damaged, the ship stood, tall, proud, like a wounded lion refusing to fall. After Cordell's dreadnought had been destroyed and the Keller fleet thrown into confusion, Holt knew it was the perfect moment to act. They could not waste the shock that had spread through the enemy lines. He ordered the remaining fleet to strike small, fast, and precise. Celia stood beside him in the command center, her hands behind her back, eyes fixed on the tactical map. The stolen data from the enemy dreadnought had revealed more than just fleet codes. It exposed weak points in their supply chain, routes they never expected anyone to know. Using that information, the humans launched quick assaults on those supply lines. Within hours, enemy carriers were burning, fuel depots were crippled, and key relay ships were gone. The Keller ships started pulling back, some without a fight, others in blind rage, firing wildly as they fled. Holt stayed calm through every order, his voice steady. He had no time to celebrate. He knew they hadn't won the war, not yet. But they had created something far more important: fear. For the first time, the Keller were afraid, and that fear gave humanity space to breathe. But peace was still far off. The Vanguard's engines were unstable, and the Hellstorm cannon had nearly destroyed the power core. Chief engineers said they had maybe one good jump left before the drive collapsed for good. Holt made a hard decision. He ordered the fleet to begin evacuation protocols. Smaller human ships were sent ahead to safer space, carrying wounded and civilians. The Vanguard would remain behind a little longer, acting as a shield while the others escaped. Celia stayed with Holt. When asked why, she said quietly, "Because I owe you everything, and I don't run." Together, they moved from deck to deck, helping with repairs, giving orders, and making sure no one was left behind. In the med bay, Celia visited Corbin, who was awake now, resting, as he gave her a tired smile and thanked her. She nodded but said nothing. Words still felt too small. In the hangar, Viga was helping load evac pods, her legs still bandaged, but her voice strong. Even wounded, the humans didn't stop. That was something Celia had never seen before. Pain was not weakness, too. Them, it was fuel. It made them stronger. Outside, enemy ships circled again, not in full attack, but in slow movements like beasts trying to figure out if the wounded prey still had teeth. Celia watched them from the observation deck, her eyes sharp. Holt stood beside her. They both knew another fight was coming. Cordele's death had shaken the Keller, but it would not stop the war. Someone else would rise to take his place. When they did, they would come harder, with more force. Celia turned to Holt and asked him if he thought they would survive. The next wave? Holt shrugged and said, "Maybe not. But we'll make them bleed before we fall." Then he looked at her with something deeper in his eyes. Not just respect, but trust. Real trust. And in that moment, she felt it too. Not just loyalty, not just duty, but something stronger, belonging. As the final wave of evac ships left the Vanguard, Holt gave the order to prepare the last jump. It was a risk. The ship's core was unstable. They tried to jump and failed. They would explode mid-flight, but staying meant death anyway. They had one shot. The crew gathered in their stations, ready. The lights dimmed. The ship groaned. Celia sat at the main console, rerouting power while Holt entered the jump codes. The enemy had noticed. A small group of Keller cruisers closed in, firing warning shots. They didn't want the Vanguard to escape, but Holt didn't flinch. He told the crew to hold their fire. All energy had to go to the jump. The countdown began. 5 minutes. 4. The enemy ships opened full fire. Explosions shook the walls. Sparks rained from the ceiling. Still the crew stayed focused. Celia worked quickly, bypassing failed circuits, redirecting coolant, forcing power into the drive. Her hands were steady. She didn't panic. Holt shouted commands, his voice rising over the alarms. Then 1 minute left. The main engine glowed, trembling. Holt turned to Celia. She gave a nod. She had done all she could. The rest was chance. 30 seconds. Outside, the Keller ships prepared their boarding beams. They were coming fast. Inside, the Vanguard roared. With strain, 10 seconds. Celia closed her eyes and whispered something in her old language. Not a prayer, not exactly, just a promise. A promise that she would not go back to being a weapon. She would live. 5 seconds. Holt gripped the console, said, "See you on the other side," and the jump hit. The stars stretched into lines, the light twisted. The ship screamed, but it held. And then silence. The Vanguard reappeared. In safe space, far from the battlefield. The hull was cracked. Systems were failing, but the crew was alive. They had made it. A cheer rose through the ship, weak but real. They had survived. Celia looked around at the faces near her, human faces, smiling through blood and soot, and for the first time, she smiled to not just for victory, but because now she believed. In something, she believed in them. Holt stood beside her, hands on the rail, breathing heavily. He looked at her and said, "You stepped into the wrong room that day." Celia shook her head and answered softly, "No, I stepped into the right one." Then she looked out the window, into the stars ahead. Oh, there'd be more battles, more pain. But now she was ready, because she was no longer alone. She was one of them. She was home. The Vanguard floated quietly in deep space, far from the war zone it had barely escaped. Its hull was battered, its engines barely alive, and its crew exhausted, but it was still standing. Inside the ship, repair teams worked around the clock, patching what they could. Medics moved from room to room, tending to the wounded, while engineers crawled through vents and under decks, welding broken pipes and restoring life support systems. There was no cheering now, no loud victories, just quiet survival. The crew was tired, bruised, and running on willpower alone, but no one gave up. Holt moved slowly through the corridors, checking on his people. Every nod, every salute he received meant more than medals. It meant they still believed. Celia stayed by his side, helping where she could, lifting wreckage, fixing connections, giving strength simply by being there. The woman who had once been the enemy was now part of the heart that kept the ship alive. And though she still felt like an outsider sometimes, the looks she received had changed. No longer suspicious, no longer cold, just respect and something even warmer - trust. One day after the jump, a distress signal came through the communication deck. A human colony ship, Hope's Reach, was stranded in a nearby sector. Its engines had failed during a retreat from the Keller front, and it was drifting, low on power, with hundreds of refugees aboard. Celia watched Holt's face as he read the message. She could see it clearly he didn't want to risk the Vanguard. Not in its fragile state, but he also couldn't ignore it. Holt was the kind of man who would rather die trying to save others than live knowing he could have helped and didn't, so he gave the order they would go. The crew didn't complain. They didn't ask questions. They just moved. Power was rerouted. Weapons were shut down to push more fuel into the engines. Even the wounded helped, guiding wires, holding tools, doing anything they could. Slowly, the ship turned and headed toward the distress beacon. The journey was slow. Every pulse of the engine shook the Vanguard like it might come apart. But they reached the colony ship after nearly a full day of crawling through space. What they found was worse than expected. The Hope's Reach was heavily damaged, its hull torn open in 2 places. Fires still burned inside. And were stew. Keller Raider ships were already there, circling like vultures. Holt clenched his jaw. They weren't ready for a fight. Not in their condition. But if they didn't act now, the refugees would be dead. Celia stepped forward and offered a plan. She said she could sneak aboard one of the raider ships and sabotage it from within. It was dangerous. It was crazy. But it might give the Vanguard a small opening. Holt didn't like it, but he didn't say no. He looked at her and said, "You don't owe us this," Celia answered. "I don't owe you. I'm part of this now." And with that, she suited up. Celia left in a small stealth pod, dark and silent. She flew low, using wreckage to hide her approach. She knew Keller patrol routes. She knew how their sensors worked. And when she reached the first raider ship, she slid through a maintenance vent like a ghost. Inside it was cold, dark, and full of whispers. Keller crew moving through the halls, speaking in the tongue she had once called her own. It almost hurt hearing it again, but she didn't stop. She moved quietly, planting charges near the power core. Then she slipped toward the bridge, shut down their scanners, and sent a signal to Holt. One word, now. At that moment, the Vanguard powered forward, guns hot. It didn't have much left to give, but it gave everything. The first shot hit. The second raider ship straight in the side, buying precious seconds. The second blast, weaker, took out the raiders' weapons. Then the Vanguard launched shuttles toward the Hope's Reach, pulling the civilians aboard as fast as they could. Inside, the enemy ship alarms blared. Celia ran, dodging guards, climbing ladders, crawling through vents. When the charges she planted exploded, the raider ship tilted hard, fire spreading through its lower decks. She reached the airlock just in time, where a recovery pod launched. From the Vanguard pulled her in with seconds to spare. As she collapsed onto the floor, breathing hard, Holt's voice came through her earpiece. "You did it." She smiled faintly and whispered, "Told you I could." The rescue took only 15 minutes, but every second was a fight. Explosions rocked both ships. Fire spread. But the vanguard didn't break. The crew didn't panic. They worked as one. Strong, despite their pain, holding the line. When it was over 700 civilians had been pulled from Hope's reach. Families, children, old men and women. People who had lost everything but were still alive. When the last shuttle docked and the vanguard pulled away, cheers rang out again, not loud this time, not wild, but full of quiet pride. They had risked everything and saved lives. Celia stood beside Holt once more, her hair singed, her suit torn, but her eyes burning bright. And when the refugees looked at her, they didn't see a former enemy. They saw someone who had saved them. That night, Celia sat alone in the crew mess, a cup of cold water in her hands. She stared at it, thinking, not of war or death or pain, but of something strange, peace. For the first time in her life, she could feel it inside her chest, soft but real. Holt found her there, sat across from her without saying a word. They sat in silence for a long time. Then he said, "You keep surprising me." She looked up, smiled slightly, and replied, "I keep surprising myself." And outside, beyond the windows, stars shimmered like quiet promises. The galaxy was still broken, the war far from over. But for now, they had light, and they had each other.